Good afternoon. Today is August 24th, 2023, and my name is Ebony Love. I am physically located in Jacksonville, Florida, and I have the honor of interviewing Bidtah Becker. And Bidtah, can you first start by telling me where you are physically located?
I am physically located in Fort Defiance on the Navajo Nation.
Okay.
And in what we say nowadays is in an area now called Arizona, right along the border of New Mexico.
Okay. And this interview is made possible via Zoom technology, and we are audio recording only. Can you kind of explain how, can you explain kind of what you just said with the where you're located and how you kind of break that down so that people who have never heard that terminology before can kind of understand?
Yeah, and I appreciate it because and apologies for that background noise. I'm on my phone. So I am 52, and so I did not grow up with the same sort of terminology that folks use today. So it's very refreshing, and sometimes it doesn't roll off my tongue. But what I mean by that is before the United States was ever a twinkle in anybody's eye, there were people living in what we now call the United States of America. And so that's the phrase I think I use, what we now refer to as. Um, and before the United States, they weren't the first non-Indians or non-Indigenous people to come out here. There was Mexico and the Spaniards. And one of the things, I'm Navajo, and there's a group of Indigenous people who call themselves Pueblo, which is a Spanish term. They always like to point out that this region of the United States we're in was under Spanish rule for 300 years, and the United States hasn't even existed for 300 years. So when I often like to say that I'm on the Navajo Nation, and the states of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico encroach upon the Navajo Nation because, again, they were formed much, much later than the Navajo people who were living here and how they identified their boundaries.
And you started off your answer by saying that this terminology hasn't always been around. How have you kind of seen the terminology change over your lifetime?
Yeah. So, I'm a child largely of the 80s, having been born in the 70s. And I think that when I was a young child, I think the United States was palpably living in a post World War II environment. And the reason I focus on that is because I think that there was a sense of unity about that war and about fighting what was undeniably, an evil opponent, I guess is the term I'll use. At least definitely in Nazi Germany. And others can, have their own judgment on Russia and Japan. And all of this is probably more poignant as we speak because Oppenheimer was just released, right? So these things are on top of people's minds right now. Um, and I think, the environmental movement, had already started. And by the time I became a professional, there was already a lot of discourse happening in undergraduate institutions about things like critical race theory. Just kind of, I think, readdressing the way we look at the world. And it's interesting, you're history focused because along my life, somebody taught me that at some point in time, the way history was taught, it was a Germanic method, which is you focus on the nation state. And so I think that's the big difference, which is the focus on the nation state is not as heavily emphasized today as it was for somebody like me growing up in the 1980s with the Cold War, right? We really focused on nation states back then. And now I think it be with climate change and other movements, people are dissecting the world or categorizing the world and what I would call much more organic ways. And by organic, I mean ways that are consistent with being biological beings.
Thank you for that. Okay, so going back to kind of your origins, do you live where you were born, or like kind of can you tell me about your early childhood years?
Yeah, sure. So, my dad is actually an attorney, and he is a non-Indian, and my mom is Navajo. And they met when my dad was in law school in New Mexico. And so my early years, we were moving around the country as my dad was developing his career. And we finally moved back. I was born in New Mexico. I was born on the reservation, but not where I currently live. And then by fourth grade, we ended up back in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that's where I went to high school and what I consider my hometown. I moved out here with my husband 21 years ago, and we have teenagers now, and this is all they know is their home. I think they consider Fort Defiance their home. Traditionally, you are from where your umbilical cord is. So I buried my kids' umbilical cords where mine were buried, which is on the eastern side of the Navajo Nation. It's rough guess, maybe 90 miles northwest of Albuquerque as the crow flies. Um, so yeah, I I think that's a fair rendition of my origin story.
And can you explain that? You're from where your umbilical cord is. Where did that tradition come from?
Um, excuse me. Um, I don't know the origin of that tradition. That's a Navajo tradition.
Mhm.
It's just what I've always known. Um, and so now I'm gonna have to go ask somebody, like, where do we know the origin of where that tradition's what the story is behind that tradition? It's it's not an uncommon tradition among Indigenous people
Mhm.
that, where you bury your umbilical cord is fundamentally where you're from. And again, it's I shouldn't say again because I don't think we've talked about this, but it's the tie to the land, and it's the tie to, I think, being a biological being. It's funny because I was raised a Catholic. I'm not practicing Catholic anymore. I mean, my not that I was, but I went to a Jesuit undergrad, and the whole concept of ashes to ashes, right? It's that I always thought that was so interesting. I've always thought that was very interesting how there's sometimes criticism of um I don't want to say Christianity, but criticism of how um modern day humans tend to distance themselves from their biological essence. And yet, if you're Catholic, you are reminded constantly ashes to ashes. The point is I think of that often when I think of bearing the umbilical cord. It's just a recognition of where we come from and where we're going to end up.
Thank you. Um, so you just mentioned that your dad was an attorney. So did you always know as a young person that you wanted to be a lawyer?
Um, Absolutely not. And so that's the funny thing. So New Mexico's a very, very small state, and maybe 2 million at this point. Anyway, and so people always assume that that's what I wanted to be. Absolutely not. The last thing I wanted to be was an attorney, right? Because my dad was one. But through education and life experience, especially as Native people, because of our relationship with the federal government, and especially if you live on the reservation, you live under three jurisdictions: the tribe, the state, the United States. I mean, the bureaucracy, the stuff that we go through. Going to law school is a lot like um, going just to college for a lot of students, because you get a lot of questions answered that you can't get answered when you don't go to law school, if that makes sense. Because of the treaty nature of some tribes' relationships with the United States, but largely because of the land base, especially if you live on your reservation. It's really hard to decipher why things are happening or what are happening if you don't have that law background. So, I took some time off under undergrad and just, as I looked around and I was interested in social justice work, it just became clear that it's very difficult to do social justice work in the Indian world without having a legal background. You don't necessarily need to be a lawyer, but you need to understand the legal jargon to understand why things are happening.
And can you unpack that a little bit? And before you answer, giving my own kind of perspective, I think I came to the same kind of conclusion. I thought that I wanted to do things in health justice. And so I kept trying to
Mhm.
find internships where I could, try to figure out what health justice meant. But it wasn't until I ended up at a law firm where I understood that having access to the legal understanding about how everything worked, that's what prompted me to go to law school. And so can you unpack that kind of, I can't understand how to help with social justice with causes that are important to you and your people unless I get that legal understanding.
Yeah. So one of the terms that's thrown around a lot in Indian country is whose jurisdiction are you under? So sometimes just figuring out who legally has the authority to help you can be, a never ending process. So compare that to somebody who, like a non-Indian who's just living in a city and, oh, they need X benefit. Well, they know exactly where to go to. And a lot of times it's like you go knock on city hall's doors and they'll help you, or they know where to send you. And that's not necessarily the case for Native people. So for instance, health, yeah, the federal government runs a health program for Native people that you can access even if you don't live on the reservation. If you are trying to, and this has also been in the news a lot lately because the Indian Child Welfare Act was recently up in front of the Supreme Court. So, a lot of people in the United States learned about the hoops you have to go through to have a Native child adopted or even foster cared. Um, and then for some people, they might be getting certain benefits either from the tribe or from the United States that are unique to them because of their native status. Um, and I mean the list goes on and on. And I love your example of health justice, right? Because oh my gosh, how much of the health world is really just it's about Medicaid or Medicare, right? I mean, and it has nothing to do with the health of the person. Zero to do with the health of the person. And I do natural resources, environmental work, more in natural resources, and talk about and it's one of the reasons I love doing natural resources work is at the end of the day, the natural resources governing. Like no matter so like unlike health, where humans are still so stubborn, right? If that makes sense. It's like they're still so stubborn. And I have, because of my age, I have a lot of conversations with men who are like realizing the primary your primary healthcare provider is you first, and then right. But when it comes to natural resources, I mean, look at climate change, right? Like Mother Nature is still in charge, and that's why I love this work because she is still in charge, and no matter how stubborn we are, we're still not going to be able to control Mother Nature or our biological essence, no matter how healthy we eat or how much we exercise. There's either something genetic or, God forbid, there's something toxic in your environment that's making you sick, right? So yeah, it just became so clear that without a legal understanding, I wouldn't be able to help Native people. And then I was very naive in law school. I thought I could do criminal defense work, which is not that is not me nor my personality. But that's a whole other world to talk about, which is um, when I was younger, I don't know if they still say this because I don't do criminal work anymore, but we used to say that the largest federal reservation in the country is the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And I believe at the time the statistics supported that. Like that wasn't just, conjecture. It was like how many Native people were locked up in federal prison. And that has to do again with the jurisdictional issues, the something called a federal law called the Major Crimes Act, and how the federal government still has really primacy over federal criminal jurisdiction on Indian country. And I mean, sometimes you just have to laugh about these things because it's so silly. Like, I mean, and it's silly because a lot of minors get then thrown into the Federal Bureau of Prisons because of this. Just heartbreaking. And I think it's really the minors that tip the scales. So anyway, sorry, I'm kind of babbling at this point, but kind of just walking down memory lane in my head about what was I thinking at the time. And yeah, and I had also spent time, I mentioned that I had taken time off between undergrad and law school. And so I lived in Latin America. I lived in Central America doing healthcare work. And I was living with a group of people called the Rama people. And again, even there, in what they had done in Nicaragua in the 1980s, again, to get greater autonomy over their lives, they created the autonomous region of Western Nicaragua so that the indigenous people would have more say over their day-to-day life. And at the time, I don't know if this is true anymore, but at the time, it had been kind of deemed a failure because they didn't have any resources. So and I'm pausing because it's just that's without money, without access to capital, governance can't happen. So again, it's this interplay, right, between the law and everything is, how I think I ended up in going to law school. And then, as I mentioned, thought I would do criminal defense work. That was ridiculous. Like I look back on it now, and took took a little more time off after law school to try to figure out what I really wanted to do. And I had a very short time clerking for a federal judge, and that's when I realized this is not for me. And so this is the early 2000s, and our chief federal judge, I'll never forget, and he was a Republican appointee, was known to be a conservative. On the front page of the local Albuquerque newspaper, which is the big newspaper, it was top of fold, chief federal judge says he is an AIDS judge. Aliens, Indians, and drugs. And that is not what, an Article 4 judge is supposed to be doing. And it was like, my God, if this guy who's in the position has all this power is saying this, then I should be true to myself and figure out where is my time and energy best spent. So then I ended up coming back to the Navajo Nation, and for 21 years have been working for the nation either as a lawyer or in some politically appointed position focused on natural resources, or right now I'm in the president's office. For 21 years, that's what I've been doing. And so I found my passion. I mean, that's the point in the whole story. And if there are any law students who can listen this long to a YouTube without a video, which I'm highly doubtful of, take your time. Like, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to find your passion. It was at the time I talked to lots of federal law clerks who were just struggling, and it just wasn't it wasn't what they had thought it would be. And I don't necessarily mean the federal clerkship, I mean the law. I remember talking to one person who was like, my God, it's just one insurance company suing another. Like that's all like she was spending her time on. Because I worked for a federal district judge, and at the time, they were really there weren't enough judges. I think they've cured that 20x number of years later, but we would have to go down to the border. And so you'd have to go down and sentence all these people at the border. I mean, it's exactly what the judge said, aliens, Indians, and drugs. And, probably half of the time was spent just sentencing people. And it was, it would be like, it would be Hispanic name like Martinez, and then it would be like a Navajo name like Begay. Martinez, Begay, Martinez, Begay, Martin, all day long. And then I should say I did take there's 9 months where I did not work for the Navajo Nation or some entity of the Navajo Nation, and that was because of COVID. And I went to work for California Environmental Protection Agencies, and an incredible job. It was a dream job. But then the Navajo Nation president asked me to come home, so I did. And I'm going down that memory lane because that's how you and I met, through Moy, and that's how I met Moy.
Okay, I just have a couple of really quick follow-ups from your answer. You said that you were working with the Rama people of Nicaragua. Is that correct?
Correct.
And how do you spell that?
Ramah.
Okay, because I definitely spelled that wrong. And then you said you would alternate between last names, Martinez Begay. How do you spell Begay?
Begay.
Okay. And so the reason I ask these questions is if there's a student out there listening to this interview and they're trying to do future research, here's your starting point to Google these names and these peoples to understand a little bit more about the kind of journey that you went through. So you kind of transitioned into the legal profession, but how did you choose a law school, and kind of what was your experience like when you were studying law?
So the law school choice was pretty simple, although at the time it didn't feel simple because I had gone to Georgetown University, so I had felt the need to go to another semi-prestigious law school. And thank God, two things: I had taken time off, and secondly, I went on a tour of Georgetown Law School, and I ran into one of my classmates who was there. And he asked me, "Where do you want to end up?" I was like, "Well, I want to end up back home." He's like, "Well, go to school there." Best piece of advice I ever got. Thank God for him. And on many levels, because it's a public school, so it wasn't expensive. So I wasn't drowning in debt when I came out. And that's the first thing I tell students is I try to pass that exact advice on, which is, where do you want to end up and what do you want to end up doing? And write that down for yourself and stay, you can switch, but you want to always kind of check in with yourself, because as type A students who are used to excelling, it's easy to get sucked into the prestige wheel, especially for students of color. I remember when I was at Georgetown, this professor, she was a white theology professor, grew up in Montana. So she had quite a bit of knowledge of Indian country. And when I was just like, and actually this is a funny story too, because and it's funny, because she was a huge influence on me going to law school, because I was thinking becoming a teacher, because I think you can have so much influence as a teacher. And as we talked, she really convinced me that I needed to at least apply to law school and pursue parallel tracks. But one of the things she also said to me that was invaluable was, why does she keep running into Native people in positions that they're not qualified for? And she didn't mean it in a racist way. She meant like young people being thrown into positions that they just don't have the life experience for. Like why aren't they as people simply saying, no, like give me like 10 years, let me get some time under my belt, and then and I just thought that was really interesting and was true. I don't know if it's true anymore, but I definitely do think it was true at the time. But importantly for Native students, New Mexico, a couple of things. They in the late 60s, they were really the first law school to pursue not just educating Native American students, but reinvigorating the whole body of law called federal Indian law. And again, I'm just laughing because it's all you can do in these situations. Because I guess because of something we call racism, just the way federal Indian law had been treated over the years it's constantly shifting. with the winds of time. I feel like when the Dobbs decision came out on abortion, people finally understood what it was like to be Native American, but that happening every other year rather than every 50 years, if that makes sense. So it's like, oh Lord, here we go to the Supreme Court again. It's like, who knows what they're gonna rule? Like, we don't know. But what these professors did was they republished an early treatise on federal Indian law that had been redrafted by the federal government. Well, it had originally been drafted by the federal government and then redrafted by the federal government to be less pro-tribal sovereignty. So they pulled out the original draft that if anybody has been following federal Indian law recently, there was a decision that came out about Navajo and water out of the Supreme Court, and he's just spaced his name. The Supreme Court justice. It was a 5-4 decision, and the Supreme Court justice from Colorado wrote the dissenting opinion. And it's funny. I never would have thought my whole life I would advise people to read a dissenting opinion, but this is a dissenting opinion to read, because he very much is in that vein of, this is what our relationship with tribes is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about sovereign to sovereign. It's supposed to be concepts that the federal government, and especially in the 50s and 60s, were trying to destroy. So these professors republished the original treatise. So I'm kind of digressing, hoping that a native student is listening, so that they might be inspired to look at New Mexico just because of their long history. And then importantly, I'd mentioned they were training native students. So they had started a program that's still in existence and native students should definitely do. It's called a pre-law summer institute for native students. So to get to your point about law school, it's harrowing, it's horrible, and it's going to, but the point of this program, it's a 6 or 8 week program where they put you through what they call a boot camp of first year classes, so that when you walk into your first year, you know what to do, how to study, how to pace yourself. And it was awesome. And my husband, who's actually a non-Indian, did notice that the native students who went through that had such confidence, that nobody else had. Which, I mean, imagine that, right? Imagine like a place where the people of color are confident in a mainstream setting. Now, I mean, and the reason I'm pausing myself on saying now is because law school is one thing. I loved law school. The practice of law and being out, it was a totally different experience. But I will say it's so fun now because of Black Lives Matter, because of COVID, because of climate change. The dialogue is just so different and exciting, and we can talk about the tensions in the system in a way that I don't think we could talk about pre all of these movements. Because fundamentally, the fundamental point of the United States is to get land for its citizens. And that is still just fundamental. And when we talk about land, it includes the natural resources. Ergo, if people are listening, they should go read this Navajo Nation versus, it started out as Navajo Nation versus U.S. Department of the Interior 20 some years ago. I think the name is now Arizona versus Navajo.
Arizona versus Navajo Nation, and then the dissenter was Justice Gorsuch.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, Justice Gorsuch nailed it. He nailed everything in terms of not just the law, but also the reality. And his line that, well, the Navajo will just have to get in another line at the DMV, underscores the very start of our conversation about the law. I mean, I loved his analogy to the DMV. He nailed it, because at the end of the day, as shocking as the opinion was to a lot of people, to me, as a Navajo practitioner who's been doing water for the Navajo Nation for 21 years, it was like 5-4. Wow, this is exciting. Like 4 people got us. Like that world never existed before. And then Justice Gorsuch really, really, really gets us and wrote an opinion that really supports the Navajo Nation. Wow, things are changing for sure. Because at the end of the day, what we have to explain back home is it didn't really change anything for us. Justice Gorsuch is absolutely right. You know, we tried to get the federal government to live up to what we think is their obligation, and 5 people said it's not their obligation. But you know, as a lawyer, well, no, maybe the Department of Interior really could still do more by the Navajo people. Nothing's preventing them from doing more. But importantly, what this case is fundamentally about is whether or not a tribe can sue the federal government under a treaty for a specific form of relief. And if you read the opinion, you'll find out that the 5 people are basing their decision on a Supreme Court decision that was issued under the Obama administration. And I have to chuckle because, like, sometimes people don't think about it those that way, but whether it's the Obama administration or the Biden administration, they still weren't on our side, right? Which, yeah, I mean, and that's what I think most people are most shocked about. And that's where I come back to, but you just have to remember they're not bad people. They're enforcing the system that they have. And that's what the system is, right? And that's why you have to, that's why we need more representation in the law and in all these areas so that the voices are heard and people can look at these laws and policies in what I don't know what the right word is. Maybe I want to use the word enlightened. I don't think that's the right word, but I think in a way that is more true to, again, what I've said before, Mother Nature and our biological essence. Because I think what shocked people about the Navajo case, it's like, there's no question people need water. And how is it that the Department of the Interior is not doing everything they can to support the Navajo people to get water, right? Right. When you distill it to its essence, I get it. But I get why people are so upset. But when you overlay the law, and law is simply history, think about it, folks. Yeah, I see you nodding your head like law is history. And what is our history? And what are our laws supporting? Are they supporting, so there's one other concept, which is we're supposed to be in an era of self-determination. And I have said many times and many times publicly that we are not truly in an era of self-determination because the underlying system still exists, right? Until it's no different than Black Lives Matter. Like until you get into it and really tear it apart and say, you know what? Let's do with regulation 1.15235.x, or let's look at where we spend our money. Let's look at how our budgets are. Until you tear it apart, you are still carrying on the policies of the past. And that's fundamentally what's going on. And cases like Navajo Nation is just a reminder to people. It's a reminder to people who don't do this every day. So again, for somebody like me, 5-4 and Justice Gorsuch's dissent. Wow, I was jumping. I mean, yes, we wanted to win the case. Don't get me wrong, but this wasn't. It could have been so much worse, right? It could have been a Dobbs decision. It could have been something really, 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 really hurting us. But it did exactly what Justice Gorsuch said. So we just have to get back in another line and at the DMV. And what we mean by that is another way to address our water needs on the Navajo Nation is to do what's called a settlement of our claims. And we are actively working to settle our claims. So all is not lost, and we didn't lose that opportunity. So we keep at just as Gorsuch says, the Navajo Nation will, I forget the exact quote, but it's like, we'll continue to fight their fight. So anyway, it's a lot of this is code unless you really understand this area of the law. So I hope I'm not losing you or other folks listening.
You're not, but that was actually my next question. So, how would you explain your work to someone who doesn't know what tribal water rights, energy, and environmental justice mean?
Mm, that's a really good question because one of the reasons I loved California was the environmental justice conversations were so much further advanced than they are in so many parts of the country. I think talking to a lay person, I would say it's, well, let me back up. What I often say is, um, I I think this geographer from Hawaii got it right. My son had a book about like it was a seventh grade book by this Hawaii geography professor who it was just an overview of like geography and interesting things, and he was talking about American Indians in the United States. And he said, the reconnection of the human family happened in 1492, and we're still trying to figure out how to make it work. So even though my focus is on the natural world, it still fundamentally is about um, getting 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 a system that allows Navajo people to thrive and live on their homelands, if that makes sense. And by thrive, I mean, have access to clean drinking water, but also have access to opportunities. And the opportunities don't have to necessarily be exactly the same as what's off reservation, but they have to be sufficient so that people can stay on the reservation, lead healthy lives. And I literally mean by access to flushing toilets and electricity and clean drinking water, because too many more people still don't have that. Yeah, and be able to do that on the Navajo Nation, which is within the United States of America. And those are tall orders. And let me give you an example why I say that's a tall order. Because one, again, the United States, their goal and the state's goals is to provide land and resources for their people. So over the years, the question is, well, who's their people? Are Indian people their people? And I think it was 1948, Indian people finally got the right to vote in Arizona and New Mexico. So until you have the right to vote, right, you're not really their people, right? But I think there are just some other really stark examples. So the Navajo Nation has a lot of natural resources, including coal, uranium, oil, and gas. And I'll just focus on coal. So in the 60s and 70s, coal was developed, and the largest coal-fired power plant west of the Mississippi was built on the Navajo Nation. It was built on the Navajo Nation at the request of the Sierra Club because they didn't want the United States to continue damming the Colorado River. And so we have this anyway, but I won't go down that path because I'm getting into too many details. But the point is that coal-fired power plant and the transmission lines that delivered the electrons it was owned by Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, Nevada, two Arizona utilities. Not a single electron was used on the Navajo Nation. Right? That's what I mean. And this is an ancient history. I think it came into production in the 1970s, right? I mean, this isn't like, we're not talking about like, oh, no. This is in the 1970s, and this power plant is not going to, none of the power is actually going to be used on the Navajo Nation. One of my federal allies who is with the Park Service, because again, they're working under laws that were written, in the early 1900s, and she goes back to the law that she's working on, and she's like,
clearly, like the way they wrote this law was not with a modern Navajo Nation in mind, right? Because again, it was about it. It was about there was just this fundamental concept that Indian people would go away. And I don't necessarily mean by genocide. I mean, they'll just go away. Like our society is so great. They'll just all decide to be part of our society. And then when Indian people weren't doing that, they did create assimilation programs in the 1950s and 1960s where they would give people one-way tickets to like the big cities, literally one-way tickets, sometimes to go to trade school, but no support to get back. And my mom went through one of those programs. But that's my point about the policy, right? Has that policy really ever gone away? And when I talk about self-determination, that's what I mean. You can't say we are self-determining when some like that law, that very law where a federal official will say and has said publicly, this law that I'm working under never envisioned, the Navajo Nation, Navajo people driving cars, like, living the way that they do today. When she's working under that law, how can we self-determine, right? When her hands are tied to this ancient, well, I shouldn't say ancient, but this, I would say not even outdated policy, because I don't think it was ever a right policy, but it was a one-sided policy, right? It's like they're going to go away, right? And so
I kind of wondered too, like maybe there was bias, not maybe, but bias in the people who drafted it in the first place, because like we all know about the inherent biases of older, I use older lightly, folks who, they think that people of color are less than and maybe won't advance as far enough to, own cars and things like that. And so it might be interesting, and this is just something for me personally, to go back and find some of those laws and kind of figure out where those implicit biases are, because I doubt heavily that any of those drafters were a person of color, much less a Native person or an Indigenous person. So I doubt that they had that perspective of, we're human just like you and we have the ability to self-actualize just like you.
1,000%. 1,000%. Pre-COVID, I used to always start things like this with is actually no, not pre-COVID. It was during COVID when COVID hit, Indian country and the Navajo Nation were just ravaged, and our allies were shocked. And so I was just getting all of these requests to talk to people, and I'm like, well, I have to start with like the fact that you see me as human is refreshing. Like, because you didn't pre-COVID, you didn't think I was a human being. And I'm saying this because there are people who when COVID hit, I've been doing the work, 18, 20 years, now it's 21 years. And there are people calling me who are like, oh my God, are you okay? Like, we're seeing these headlines about COVID ravaging the Navajo Nation. And it was it was wonderful because there was a point in time where none of these people would have felt comfortable doing that, right? So yes, 1,000% about being human, being lesser, and that cracks me up, especially if you know anything about Navajo, because, and what I'm about to say is controversial for some people, but it is the facts. Like horses were brought to this area by the Spanish. They were not things that Native people had beforehand. And look at who doesn't associate horses with Native people. Like, talk about advancing, right? And we have so many examples of that, like where we took exactly what the Europeans brought and took it to a different level. But yes, 1,000% that it's like you're lesser than us, and yeah, I mean, and it's like you're a museum and you're going to go away one day. Because I think even if you were smart enough to advance, you would just realize that advancing meant becoming one of us, right?
Okay, to kind of wrap up, two last questions. What is the most important aspect of your job that people may not realize as part of your job?
So I'm a problem solver and I get things done. And I think that what, but you know, I've been doing this work for a long time, and so I've developed as a human being, and so for me personally, the most important part of my job that people don't realize is the level of patience I have to have that I do not innately have. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. So said another way is, I think this is true for all of us. It's finding that weak point that's preventing you from thriving, and addressing that. I think is often the most important part of your job. Because how you approach your job is as important as the tools you have.
I think that's something that I personally have learned. I'm a baby lawyer, but you want everything to be fixed very quickly, and that's not going to happen in the legal profession. And so I really identify with that patience piece. My last kind of question is your final advice that you would like to leave for future generations. If there's someone who has never seen an attorney who looks like them and is thinking that they might want to give this profession a shot, what advice would you give them?
Well, I'm going to give you the advice that my very first employer at a law school gave, because this is true for women too, which is, you know, be prepared to work harder than everybody around you, but don't be angry about it, because you can do it and it just makes you a better lawyer. So said another way is, don't let the frustration with the the flaws both in the system and with us as human beings divert you from the good work you can do. And find, but be patient. Know that the law is incredibly conservative. And I forget. There are a lot of, people like to say recovering lawyer, and I think, and the once you become, you will never stop thinking a lawyer once you hit that point, right? Once you hit that point in law school where you're like, oh God, the synapses of my mind have shifted. I now think like a lawyer. You will always think like a lawyer. But I think just again, recognize that the law is very conservative. So you are going to feel like you're swimming upstream, but um, but change will come. And I mean, I'm living proof of that. I mean, the world I'm living in today, never ever would have imagined me living in. Um, yes, it took COVID, but again, we're biological beings. This is natural. This is part of our existence. We go through pandemics. Um, and what I mean by that is I was recruited to California because of my Indian law expertise, and never, ever in my life would I ever have imagined somebody recruiting me for my Indian law expertise into a mainstream institution like the state of California. And when I've said that before, some people will say, "Oh, don't talk bad about yourself." It's like, I'm not, I'm not, I'm talking bad about the system, but because look at how far we've come, and look at the reaction to, you know, um, look at the reaction post COVID compared to post the Spanish flu, right? Post the Spanish flu, it was not only business as usual, but perhaps even worse. The number of lynchings that were happening, the reaction again to it was not let's come together and help every single person thrive in the United States of America. It was everybody in their corners again. So and the only way to ensure that policy, that spirit survives, is through the law, and making sure you institutionalize that sort of spirit. And don't let it pass you by.
You have actually just shifted my perspective a lot in your last lines. I never really thought about, how did society change after the Spanish flu? But now I'm going to start thinking about that a little bit more. Thank you so much for your time. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope that others will too. And I'm just really appreciative for your time.
Oh, and I appreciate you doing this. This is, really, yeah, no, this is great work and that you're spending your time doing it. Keep it up. Yeah, let's just keep the dialogue going.
Thank you, and have a great day.
You too. So nice to meet you.